Hi, everybody, and welcome to this Country Navigator Masterclass. My name's Dr. Andy Bruff. I'm part of the faculty for Country Navigator based in Knysna in South Africa. I've been with the organization going on 16 years now and work primarily in the area of leadership and high-performing teams. And certainly over the last 20 years have spent time looking at this notion of the borderless workplace. This idea that we are no longer constrained by location as much as questions around autonomy and collaboration. So the question today, where in the world is my team, is an opportunity for us to take the next 58 minutes or so together to really talk about how do we enhance collaboration in our teams when we're trying to underpin that from the basis of what we like to refer to as cultural intelligence. And we'll talk more about that in the course of our time together. So before we get into a lot of the content, let me start by asking you to give me some context. And that context, as we look at the second slide, is really about trying to understand what is your team context. Where are they based? Are they all based in one office? Are they based around the world? Are you something of a hybrid team? Are you completely remote? So Luke, why don't you go ahead and start that first poll for us? And then we'll give you an opportunity as you are participating with us, team, to just fill in your answers to that survey. What is your team context? Help us to get some understanding of how you are viewing the world around the question, where in the world is my team? And as you're answering that question, I think what's interesting is over the years that we've asked this particular question of many leaders like yourselves, we're definitely seeing a trend. And that trend does seem to track even as I look at the answers coming through here. So I've got about 85% of you who've participated. We'll take another 4 or 5 seconds and then we'll end that poll. And then I'll ask Luke just to share the results with you. So as you see that, if we just share those results now, you'll see that we've got a large percentage of you who are completely hybrid, a lower percentage who are entirely remote, a similar sort of number who are all based in one office, and about 32% of you who are mostly based in one office. Certainly what we're seeing as we ask this question increasingly is that move towards either being hybrid or in some cases entirely remote. And so this question of collaboration, of being a high-performing team, of being able to work together and to navigate the challenges that are presented by time zones, by geography, by distance, the challenges presented by isolation, by fragmentation, by confusion, are things that we need to be able to understand and address in this world of work. I'd like a little bit more detail from you. And Luke has a link that he's going to place into chat, which will enable us to work in a virtual whiteboard, a mural. So if you click on that link that is in chat now, it will take you to an option where it will ask you to register. You don't need to do that. You don't need to create the account. You don't need to sign in. You can click on the third option at the bottom, which is view as a visitor. And it'll bring up a second window. You can click on that red button, view as a visitor as well. Once you're in there, you will see that it gives you a pseudonym. You're an animal, you're a crab, you're a shark, you're an owl, you're a bear. And what we want you to see is that there are two sections to this exercise. On the left-hand side, I want you to think about what is working well in your virtual team right now. And to answer that, you need to hover over that red square. That's actually a sticky note. And you double click on the sticky note and it will actually give you an opportunity to type. So once you've decided what you want to say, you just hover over that sticky note, double click on it, and it will then give you a text option. I know for some of you, it may be a little bit awkward first time round, but once you get the hang of it, it will work pretty straightforward. So again, point your cursor over a square, double click on that square, and it will then give you the option to type some text into that option. Don't worry about sizing or resizing. Luke can certainly move those around as we go. On the left-hand side, I'm looking for the good news. I'm looking for what's working well. And on the right-hand side, I'm looking for you to share with us some of your challenges, what's working less well, what you're finding difficult about working in this borderless workplace. So I'll wait for a moment. I can see you're now succeeding in entering the text. And once we've got a critical mass of entries, I'll ask Luke to actually zoom in and we'll move from left to right and look at your answers. If you're new to the mural technology, in the bottom right-hand corner of that window, there is a zoom option, so you can increase the percentage if you want to zoom in. You can also drag the entire window left and right if it's not centered up for you nicely in terms of what you're looking at. I'm going to give you a little bit more time, and then when we review this, we'll start on the left-hand side and look at what's working well, and then we'll go across to your challenges. I'm seeing some really interesting submissions, and I want to give you some more time to make sure that everybody's had a chance to answer both sides of the mural. So Luke, we've got a couple of people still typing. I think what we'll do is let's zoom in on that left-hand side if we can, and let's just enlarge that piece on what's working well. And we'll see if we can do some very quick coding and pick up some of the areas of similarity. So immediately what I'm seeing in the middle there is a whole theme around information, knowledge, and document sharing, which is very powerful. We know as we've interviewed high-performing teams that are fully remote, this notion of having a single source of truth where team members can upload, can access, can download in real time is a really important part of being able to collaborate. Also notice if you go to the top left-hand side of this particular set of sticky notes, you'll see there's reference to flexibility, to productivity, to ability to meet virtually. So that's quite a powerful one. That flexibility thing comes out 2 or 3 times. You'll also see that there is reference to trust. And down in the bottom here, we've got this idea of the cognitive diversity, the fact that in a virtual team, you've got different backgrounds, which lead to differing points of view, which can often be challenging when you've got people who are contradicting your way of thinking, but you're also avoiding that echo chamber, and that leads to higher degrees of creativity and innovation. People are talking about more effective meetings. They're talking about the ability to learn new cultures. So certainly themes around flexibility, productivity, knowledge and information sharing, understanding, learning of cultures, efficiencies and effectiveness. And right in the middle there is somebody who's talking about cost saving. And of course, that is always going to be an important driver. It's not all plain sailing though, because if we go to the right-hand side, Luke, we are obviously aware in this borderless workplace that there are significant challenges, challenges of a lack of connection. that comes through a lot, that sense of isolation, of feeling alone, of feeling disconnected. Um, the technical difficulties, if people don't have the hardware, the software, the bandwidth, that becomes hugely challenging. The fact that in many cases people are working longer. So now we've saved on travel, but we don't have the boundaries in place because your time zone is not my time zone. And so the work-life balance becomes much more of a challenge. The communication piece can be challenging, the overlapping voices and sounds, the notion of people not making the connections that they wanted to, and not being able to pick up on well-being. How are you actually doing? Becomes a more of a challenge when you're not co-located. So again, if we look at these, and I think back to the research that we've done, time and time again, we see people talking about isolation, about fragmentation, about confusion. And we know clearly that that need to engage, that need to connect, that need to create coherence is really, really important, building on this notion of clarity as you ask and answer the question, where in the world is your team? And as somebody's just typing now, that lack of non-verbal communication, particularly if you're not using webcams, can be hugely challenging, on top of which you may well be speaking in a language which is not your mother tongue. So this is really helpful. Thank you very much for that context. You may well still be typing, and of course you have the absolute freedom to do that. But Luke, I'm going to ask you to come out of that if you would, and let's go back to the presentation. And now that we've got a little bit of context, I think we can see how this can impact on the world in which we work. Now, what I love about this slide is this notion of what do we mean when we think about culture? And what you see here is something which, if you've seen it in real life, is incredibly powerful. This hippopotamus, we actually now have a podcast that we've put out at Country Navigator called the Hippo Podcast. And it plays on this idea that what you see is not the whole story. So often, if you think about a hippopotamus, you might see it resting in the water there, this massive animal, but all that you see are the eyes and the ears and possibly the snout. And it would be easy to forget that there's a whole mass under the water of this, animal, which is at one level really beautiful to look at, but is also highly dangerous in the African context. And so understanding that distinction between what you see and what you don't see becomes really important when we think about culture, about cultural intelligence, and about your team. So what do we see? Well, often when people say, I'm fascinated by the culture of X, and they've been on holiday and they've been to a foreign exotic location, what they often mean is that they are enamored by the cuisine, the music, the clothing, by how people behave in terms of language, in terms of family structure. And of course, all of that rightly is a part of the description of culture. But much like the hippo, you only get the real full understanding when you can identify what you don't see. And you start to think about the thoughts, the feelings, the biases, the assumptions, the beliefs, the value systems that are underpinning the things that we see on the surface. And so as a student of culture, I'm fascinated by what I see, but I'm also incredibly fascinated by what I don't see, and learning about those unconscious biases, about the spirituality, about the assumptions that are being made, whether that's around communication, around time, around feedback, around being more or less implicit or explicit, about how we build relationship, how we view ourselves in terms of risk. All of these dimensions start to become incredibly powerful. And I think that when we get into this notion of culture at a deeper level, we can start to develop a more richer understanding of what it means to develop that cultural intelligence. And further to that is this acknowledgement of a team that is both diverse and inclusive. So what you see on the left-hand side of the slide is an awareness of how little we see when you have everybody thinking and reasoning and regulating in a very similar way. This would be typical of a team that is not very diverse and is quite similar in terms of their cultural bias, in terms of how they see the world, how they think, and how they regulate. And the challenge with that particular set in that first diagram on the left-hand side is you often run the risk of an echo chamber, of people telling you what you want to hear, of reinforcing the stereotypes of the previously held ideas. And so there's been a significant push over the last number of years for teams to become more diverse. And what you see in the middle here is that kind of graphic, a team that is very different, that is aware of those differences, that has knowledge of the other's perspectives. But you can see that there is really nothing connecting these different perspectives. So the reality of the diversity is there, the reality of the different perspectives, of the different gender, age, background, education, professionalism, it's all there. We now have a, quote, diverse team, but we're not necessarily harnessing that. And what Matthew Syed talks about in the third diagram is developing the cultural intelligence, the skills, if you like, to become much more inclusive. And so what we end up with is this notion that diversity is a reality, but inclusion is a choice. And it's this intentional, deliberate reaching out, harnessing of the difference, and then finding ways to bring these perspectives together to create what we're calling the universe of knowledge. This notion that there is ultimately the benefit of these multiple perspectives, of this multiple experience, and harnessing that can be risky, can be challenging, can be confrontational, can stretch us as human beings. But in this world of work that is so fast and so dynamic, no single individual and no single leader can ever have all the answers. And so being conscious of the need to reach out and embrace these different perspectives and become more intentionally inclusive, I think is really important. In fact, it's paramount. So the question that I want to ask you to consider is, how do we then develop this notion of cultural intelligence? And cultural intelligence sits on three legs, and in fact, four legs, if you look at the diagram. And the first one is your attitude. A lack of cultural intelligence is often evidenced by an attitude of superiority, by an attitude of my way is best. The way that they do things is not as elegant, is not as sophisticated. So an attitude of learning, an attitude of curiosity is going to underpin cultural intelligence. And I think the second thing is an awareness of my own unconscious bias. There's a paradox there, because if it's unconscious, I'm not aware of it. So you want to move it from unconscious to conscious. And also an awareness of the fact that as you work with people from different cultures and different backgrounds, they will think and problem solve and make decisions and articulate and communicate in ways that are going to be different. And being aware of that is the beginning of this development of cultural intelligence. And then developing the knowledge about other cultures, other countries, knowledge about different ways of solving problems, knowledge about how people will be more or less implicit or explicit. And once you have that knowledge, then practicing intentionally the skills that come with it, whether that's verbal or nonverbal, written or spoken, whether that's one-to-one or one-to-many. So these become critically important in the way that we work together. Now, I think what's fascinating is for you then to think about your own team and for you to consider this question: how well do I understand the cultural preferences of my team? And I'm going to ask you to participate in our next poll, which will give you an opportunity to complete the answers to that. So go ahead and let's think about that question. How well do you think you understand the cultural preferences of your team? And we've got a couple of options there, and I will wait for you to complete that. So Luke, we're up to 84% there in participation. Let's go ahead and end that poll, and then we can share the results. And you can see that there's 19% of you who are saying you have a little understanding. We've got a large majority of you saying that you feel you've got a good amount of understanding of the cultural preferences of your team. And a couple of you saying, yeah, I believe I completely understand that. And that's very encouraging. This notion of understanding the cultural preferences of our teams becomes really important. But of course, the question we really need to ask ourselves is, well, why would that be important? Why would we need to know or measure or assess this notion of cultural intelligence? Why would we need to measure, if you like, this notion of where our team is in terms of culture? So I'm going to ask you to go ahead in chat and give me your thoughts. Just make sure that your chat is enabled. And you'll see Luke's put a question there. Why do we need to measure culture in our teams? And it's an important question as we answer this broader question of where in the world is my team. So I'm going to give you a couple of moments to give me your thoughts as you type that in chat. You should all have chat activated. There is a chat window at the bottom. And I'm going to ask you to go ahead and just give me your thoughts. Thanks, Anna, for that. And we'll wait for the others to do the same. Okay, lots of answers coming in now. You should be able to scroll through those yourselves. But let me just pick out some key ideas in just a moment as we have a few more coming through. So why do we need to measure? To be able to talk about it, to enhance the sense of belonging, to improve feelings of inclusivity and promote work effectively, improve communication, to improve collaboration, meeting our goals. More knowledge equals better understanding, respectful collaboration, the cultural nuances, being open-minded, and a number of you talk about this notion of better understanding. And I would certainly concur and echo and support all of those answers, and we would need a lot more time to unpack each of them in more detail. Now, I'm not sure how familiar you are with Country Navigator's IP, but one of the tools that we have, which is really the centerpiece of the work that we've done, is our WorldPrism profile. We have more than 1 million users now who have used this. And essentially what you're seeing here are 9 dimensions, which are clustered into 3 very specific groups. The first group is how we interact with others. And so think about those as being a continuum from left to right. The second group is regulating. This is how we manage ourselves and the world around us. And the third one is probably the most difficult, but also the most influential very often, which is our thinking styles. And so just for the alliteration, we like to talk about relating, regulating, and reasoning. And what our Country Navigator WorldPrism profile does is it gives you a score basically on a set of dots. You are somewhere along this continuum and enables you then to see to what extent you are more or less individual or group, tight or loose, or linear or circular in your thinking. But I'm going to ask you to watch a short video with me. It runs about 5 minutes 20, which will give you more insight into this notion of culture and what we mean by using this notion of measuring culture using the WorldPrism. So Luke, let's go ahead and watch that now. Thank you.
Two fish are swimming through the ocean when they hit a different current. One turns to the other and says, "Brr, the water is a bit cold today." The other fish replies, "What's water?" One of the biggest challenges of culture is that, like a fish in water, we don't notice the very thing that has such a huge impact on everything we do and think and say. Country Navigator developed the WorldPrism model of culture to help reveal the invisible. It's a framework which will help you to examine culture and identify your own cultural preferences and the preferences of those around you. WorldPrism gives you an objective, scientific way to examine culture that can help you leverage cultural differences as a positive force. WorldPrism starts with cultural intelligence at the center. Cultural intelligence impacts on the three key areas of interpersonal interaction: relating, regulating, reasoning. Relating is how we work with others. Regulating is how we manage others. And reasoning, how we think and persuade others. These three R's underpin everything. We're going to take a whistle-stop tour of each of the three dimensions that make up the three R's. Firstly, the relating dimensions. Task or relationship deals with your fundamental approach to collaboration and where your priorities are. Is your priority the task, leaving the relationship to come, or do you prefer to build a relationship up before you start on the task? Those with an explicit approach can be characterized by the saying, "I mean what I say and I say what I mean." They take the primary meaning of the words said. They are direct and can use a lot of words to avoid doubt. Implicit communicators look for meaning in the context between and around the words said. They place a lot of emphasis on subtleties of meaning, power relationships, and body language. They may say less and appear to be quieter. Individual-oriented people rely on themselves. They identify themselves separately from those around them, are self-motivated, and collaborate in order to advance their own interests. They prefer to make decisions themselves and avoid dependence on others. Those with a group orientation thrive around others. They are aware of their own limits and expect others to cover their weaker areas. They look for consensus in decisions and expect to be informed around wider events and tasks. The three regulating dimensions start with a tight, loose scale, which relates to perception of time. A tight perception sees time as a commodity with value. The amount of time you give shows the value you assign. Deadlines are important, and wasting time and interruptions are not welcomed. A loose view of time sees time as flexible. You need to adapt to circumstances, and a deadline can only be a guide or an intention. Often the journey is as important as the destination. A shared culture is one that sees power as distributed according to talent and ability. A good leader knows their limitations and brings in experts to support their decision-making. The best hierarchies are flat, and formality can slow things down. At the other end of the scale, concentrated cultures have steep hierarchies, with power kept close. Leaders are more likely to have power from their connections and will closely guard information to maintain control. Status symbols and formalities are important. The final set of reasoning dimensions focuses on how we think about problems and present solutions. Those who take a linear approach prefer structured, logical approaches to finding solutions, examining each element in sequence to find improvements. The circular thinkers prefer to step back and think around the challenge, looking at it from different perspectives, taking their time to consider as many alternatives as possible. A facts-oriented thinker is an evidence gatherer, comfortable with data and interpretation. A thinking orientation is a sign of an approach that looks at models to find general points that can be applied to the specific situation. They are more likely to look for connections between data points and look for patterns. And finally, simple complex. A simple orientation has a preference for concise, high-level arguments that get to the point quickly. An image paints 1,000 words. Short introductions are preferred. followed by a summary argument and clear conclusion. Those with a complex orientation want the details. They want to be convinced that they understand how you came to your recommendation or conclusion and need to understand the background to it, even if that means spending a lot of time. The best way to understand WorldPrism is to take the self-assessment and start understanding your profile and recognizing others.
And there you have it, a really comprehensive summary on those 9 dimensions and what they mean in terms of relating, regulating, and reasoning. Now, with that background, what I'd like us to do in the second half of this hour is to begin to get into some application. And so I'm going to share a slide with you that has quite a lot going on. And as we bring that up, let's see if we can just give you an opportunity to have a look at 2 scenarios. So Luke, if you could just advance that for me, I seem to be having some challenges in moving that along. And what you'll see there is quite a busy slide. So what I want you to imagine is we've got 2 different teams. On the left-hand side is one team. Let's focus there first. And that team is made up of 3 people. And you'll see that there are 3 different dots. So there is a blue dot that represents somebody, there is an orange dot that represents somebody else, and there is a very dark blue or black dot that represents a 3rd team member. Let's ignore the people on the right-hand side for a moment. So what you can see is that in this team on the left, there is a tendency for all 3 of these team members to be quite task-related and also more explicit in the way that they communicate. You'll also see that there is a tendency for the team to be quite individualistic. They're all reasoning from their individual perspective rather than from the collective. If you look at the risk dimension, you can see that we've got one team member, that's the orange team member who's sort of in the middle but slightly more risk averse, and then the other 2 very risk averse. In terms of time, there's a concentration around punctuality. And in terms of decision making, you've got the person in the light blue who's sort of hung between shared and concentrated, but the other 2 tend to be more shared. All 3 tend to be more linear in their thinking, more step-by-step rather than circular. And you can see that there is a tendency on the facts versus thinking dimension for them to be either more in the middle, that's the red-orange dot, or to be more focused on the conceptual, the thinking side of things. And then you can see on the last one that there is a tendency to be more complex for 2 of them and one slightly more simple. And simple doesn't mean simplistic. It just means that there is an opportunity to really bring things down to the simple steps. Now, if you look at the right-hand side, again, we've got 3 dots, but these are 3 different people in a different team. So on the right-hand side, you see a spread across task versus relationship. You see a spread across explicit, implicit. You see a spread across individual versus group. Again, the spread across risk, the spread from tight versus loose. Look at that outlier there in the orange-red who's very extremely loose in terms of time. And then if you look at linear versus circular, a broad spread, facts versus thinking again, you've got the red dot representing somebody who's very data-based, whereas the other 2 are more conceptual. And then in the bottom one, you've got this broad spread moving from somebody who is, focusing much more on bringing things down to the basics versus the light blue, who's much more complex. And so we have 3 questions that we want to ask you. And those 3 questions are going to come up now. So Luke's going to put them up one by one. The first question is, what stands out in these 2 teams? So let's stop there, Luke, and just leave that one first. As you look at those 2 teams, I've kind of already given you some insight, but maybe there are other nuances that you can highlight as you look at the data. There's a lot going on, I know, but as you look at this based on what we've shared with you in the video, what stands out in terms of how they relate, how they regulate, and how you reason? Any thoughts? Please go ahead and give me those in chat. Okay, so Paula and Stacey are both picking up on the diversity, and I think certainly we're seeing that piece. Thanks, Eva. Thanks, Rita. So certainly the diversity piece is there. And I guess if we go back to what we said earlier, the diversity is only the start. Okay, so we've got diversity, we've got different personalities. Thank you, John. Thank you, Rita. That's great. So clearly there are differences in how these individuals work with each other, how they relate, how they communicate, and their thinking styles. I want to say at this point, there's no good or bad profile. We're often asked, what is the quote ideal on these 9 dimensions? There isn't one. There is just different. And as Paulo says, the more the diversity, the greater the level of conflict. Thanks, Eva, for your correction there. I kind of sensed that was probably what you were meaning. And I think, whether team 1 is more inclusive would be a question. I think we could say team 1 is not as diverse, possibly, but whether they're more inclusive, I think we would need to know more about how they work with each other. We've also got somebody saying that the preferences on relating in the team on the left are more similar. Exactly. And of course, that's going to play into how well they can build that social cohesion. Eden, I think you're right. It's not to say that the team on the left won't have conflicts, but it's probably the case that given those broad differences across the relating, regulating, and reasoning dimensions, that those tensions, that diversity of thought and expression and interaction is going to be more obvious and more evident. Eva makes a great point as well, that when team 1 is presented with people that are more obviously different, they may have a harder time working dynamically. And that, I think, Eva, leads us to question 2, which Luke's going to pop in now, which would be, what are the strengths and weaknesses of the first team? So let's focus on the team on the left now. By first team, we mean the team on the left. Strengths and weaknesses, what are your thoughts? Give me some more detail. So we're talking about this team on the left here where I've got my green tick for now. What would you say are potential strengths? What are potential weaknesses? We've started to go there already, but let's be more focused on that. Thanks, Eva. That's great. And let's see what others come up with. Maybe you want to preface your feedback with an S or a W so that we can identify whether you see it as a strength or a weakness. Thanks, Rita. Okay, so I've got some really good feedback. We'll give you another few seconds. Okay, so we've got some of you talking about faster decision-making, possibly problem-solving, more results-focused. A weakness could be the relationships outside of the team, difficulty with decision-making. Thinking about the team on the left, Miroslava references this idea that they may come easier to the decision-making, but it won't necessarily embrace all the different perspectives, but they will have the potential to make really good quality decisions. A weakness, as John says, could be that they're less creative. Okay, so Miroslava is taking us to the team on the right. Yes, that is correct. So let's go there, Luke, with the question on team 2. What are the potential strengths and weaknesses of the second team? So that's the team on the right. Now you might say, well, it's copy and paste and reverse, but maybe there are some particular nuances that you want to highlight. Okay, so just to confirm, we're now focusing on the team on the right. Give us what you see as strengths and or weaknesses, or strengths and or growth areas. Just reiterating again that there's no such thing as a good team profile. That's just highly different. And even in that difference, the challenge will be for them to develop the inclusivity. So we've got people talking about different perspectives, creativity, innovation, creative solutions, more diverse perspectives, but it could take longer to action or to deliver. They may find some real challenges, as Stacey says, working on similar timelines and goals, given that you've got such a broad perspective around time in terms of tight versus loose. Of course, it stands to reason that the more geographically separated your team is, that they are likely to be much more diverse in terms of their profile. And there are huge benefits to that. There are also challenges in terms of developing that social cohesion and that ability to collaborate. Well, team, we're doing well, but I'm going to ask us now to move into a second exercise. So let's come out of that. And I'll ask Luke to share with you now a link again back into Mural. And this time what we're going to do is we're going to look at a more detailed scenario. So remember, again, you can ignore the sign in, you can go straight to view as a visitor in both options. And this is going to require you to zoom in, and let's focus on the left-hand side first. So what you'll see on the left-hand side is, well, let me just wait for you to all get in first so that I know that you're with me, and then I'll explain what's happening. And in this case, what I've done is I've swung my view over to the left and I've zoomed in so that you can read part one. There's some text and there's also one dimension, which is simple versus complex. So I'm seeing a lot of you in now. I'm going to just give you another 5 seconds or so, and then we'll work through this. Okay, so a couple of things that are important for part one. You'll see that there is some background to part one that explains this data analyst Sharif and Sharif's presentation to his team. Along with that paragraph is a single dimension from the WorldPrism, which is simple versus complex. Now, we don't know which of these is indicating Sharif's particular profile. All we see is the team, and you can see there is quite a significant spread in terms of standard deviations across that. So when you've looked at the paragraph and you've looked at the data point on the graph, scroll down for me and answer the questions again on the sticky notes. It says to you, take a look at this team's position on simple versus complex. What do you think is happening here? And what are the challenges? So you're going to use the data in the paragraph and the data on the graph to try and answer that question. And when you've done that, you'll see that there is a second set of questions where we're asking you to reframe those results. What are the advantages of this diverse team and how could they leverage it? So let's just focus on part one for now. There's quite a lot going on. And once I've seen the critical mass of feedback there, we'll go across to part two and look at the other team. So just for now, our focus is on the left-hand side of this exercise and part one. And thank you to those of you who are already clicking on the sticky notes and giving us your thoughts. And again, team, just to remind you, if you need to zoom in, there is the zoom function in the bottom right-hand corner. You can hit the plus or minus, or you can scroll your mouse. That will zoom, and you can also move left and right. Let's focus just for now on part one and answer the two sets of questions which are provided there. Also, please don't feel you've got to wait for me. If you want to go on to the second part of part one, where it talks about reframing the results and the advantages and leveraging. Please go ahead and do that. All right, team, just for the sake of time, if you have not yet started on the questions around reframing the results on part 1, could you please scroll down and do that? Look at some ideas around the advantages that this diverse team has and how they can leverage that, and give us some ideas. I see many of you are already there. I'm going to give you another 2 minutes before we scroll across to the right-hand side and look at part 2. I think what's interesting for me is how you're using the data points and you're able to make inferences around the differences, around the complexities, around the points of view, and how this challenge in terms of simple versus complex will play out. Luke, I realize that many of our participants today are still populating answers to part 1, but can we scroll over to part 2? I realize it won't interfere with their views individually, but I think it would be helpful for those who want to move on for us just to look at part 2. And you can see again, we've got the same scenario, the same setup, different scenario, paragraph, Sarah and Mark, and their prospect, Matteo, and then the profile. And in this case, we're looking at the dimension individual versus group, and 2 parts again. Take a look at Sarah and Mark's team position on the individual versus group dimension. What do you think happened in this example? How did their positions affect the meeting, if at all? And then in part 2, if you could just scroll down for us, Luke, you'll see that there are some questions in part 2 there, which relate specifically to I beg your pardon, there's no part 2 there. It's just that both questions are answered together. What do you think happened in this example? And how did their positions affect the meeting? So that's great. Okay, so if you haven't got there already, please get across to the Sarah and Mark Matteo exercise. And I'm going to give you 2 to 3 minutes to give us your thoughts on this one. You can see that the clustering in the dimension individual versus group is pretty obvious. So as I begin to look at your feedback, I think we can see that there is a lack of understanding. There is some conflict around the need for more collaborative thinking. There's a lack of perspective, that there is some hesitation for people to want to work together. and that possibly the unease that Matteo was feeling wasn't necessarily recognized or acknowledged. And one can probably argue that the hierarchy involved here may well have played a role too. So thank you very much to all of you who've given us your thoughts. I'm conscious that we've got about 10 minutes left, and we still have 2 or 3 areas that I want to cover. So if you're still busy with that, if you could take another 30 seconds or so just to finish off on that. But let's move on as we really consider in the next piece what this would look like in terms of a question which I think is important for you as either a team leader or a team member. If we could just advance the slide, please, Luke. What I want you to consider is that any culturally intelligent team is going to demonstrate high levels of collaboration. It's also, the research is clear now that there is this notion of rewarded vulnerability, as it was described by Dr. Tim Clark, of psychological safety. This sense of safe to feel included, safe to learn, safe to contribute, safe to challenge. There's also an innate curiosity. Help me understand. I'm going to be curious rather than furious when I'm working with people who think and respond and problem solve in ways that could well be 180 degrees different to me. And there's also a high level of adaptability. What I'd like you to consider practically as we start to move into the back end of this presentation today is, how do you think you can build collaboration using what you know about your team's culture? So early on in the piece, many of you said, yeah, you feel you've got a pretty good understanding of your team culture. So with that knowledge, what do you think you can do? Some of you might say, well, I'm not the team leader, but all of you in the team have an opportunity to bring influence even without authority. What can you do to effectively build collaboration, knowing what you know about your team's culture? What are your suggestions? Go ahead and give us your thoughts in chat, and then we'll move into the next piece. So some practical suggestions is really what I'm looking for at this stage, as we're about 7 minutes out from the top of the hour. Please go ahead and give me those in chat. So the listening piece, Eva, critical. Any other ideas, team? David, absolutely. So encouraging the cultural education, the cultural intelligence, it's a journey I've been on now for more than 30 years. And as I work with different parts of the world and different cultures, it's a fascinating journey. Developing the rules of communication, critical to the way that we work together. Let's maybe take one more. And Luke, if we can just advance to the next slide as well while we're waiting for that. Thank you. As we're seeing inputs in chat, let me also just direct you to the fact that we have a number of resources that are available to you. Tools, for example, like team charters. We have a module that introduces you to this concept, a team charter toolkit, which gives you the steps and helps you to complete the most relevant documentation with your team to create your own team charter. That could be very, very helpful. On the right-hand side, you'll see a video that I think is now our most viewed clip on our profile and on our digital assets. It's a presentation by Mark Edwards on an introduction to reflective practice. And if you're looking to develop cultural intelligence, then understanding reflective activities, thinking about recent cross-cultural situations, thinking about what's causing frustration or misunderstanding, and then looking to identify the potential cultural styles of other people, how they relate to you, how you're making cultural inferences, can be very, very powerful. So those are practical tools which are available as part of our ongoing efforts to raise cultural awareness and cultural intelligence across our client base. As we come in for a landing, let me ask you to consider one last mural activity with me. Luke will put that up on the screen, and we'll go back into our digital wall. And really, this exercise is simply a stop, start, continue. So we're going to ask you to do exactly what you've done 2 or 3 times before. Go into the view as visitor twice, and there you'll see 3 columns: stop, start, and continue. And just very, very briefly, maybe you could take one, or there may be time for you to click on all 3. From what we've discussed in the last 55 minutes, what do you, as a team member or team leader of a virtual team that may be, geographically dispersed, what do you want to stop doing? What do you want to start doing? And what do you want to continue doing? I'm going to give you a couple of minutes just to think about that before we bring this. All right, team, thank you very, very much for what you've placed into this final link. Some really great insights on stopping continuing unconscious bias or prejudice, starting to develop a greater understanding of team preferences, being aware of those differences, being more open-minded, and then continuing with the active listening, growing, and understanding those cultural differences. Incredibly powerful. Well, team, we are almost out of time. I'm going to ask you to participate in one final poll before we end the session. How useful do you think a tool like the WorldPrism is in helping you understand your team culture? I'm going to ask Luke just to pop that up for us as we bring the session to a close, and to ask you to participate in that for us. This is our last poll. It's our last piece. And while you're doing that, if you need to get access to the learning path, please email support@countrynavigator.com. I want to thank all of you for the time that you've spent with me today. Thoroughly enjoyed this masterclass, and wishing you every success as you continue to answer the question, where in the world is my team? And you move from the question of diversity to inclusion, and ultimately to effective collaboration. My thanks to Luke and to you for joining me today. Until next time, bye-bye.